If you enjoy what we do, please support the channel by giving the video a like. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where rugged ridges jutted upward like the ancient, weathered spines of slumbering giants, and the valleys plunged into deep shadows that clung stubbornly to the earth, the forest guarded its mysteries with a quiet, unyielding vigilance. The people who called those mountains home, their lives woven into the rocky soil like roots of stubborn pines, understood the unspoken rules of the land. They took only what they needed, no more, no less, knowing the forest watched them. The towering trees, their gnarled branches, creaking like brittle bones stirred by the restless wind, seemed to hold memories of every step, every fallen leaf, every breath taken in their shade. The rivers, too, murmured secrets, their icy currents weaving tales of the mountains downstream, cold and unyielding as forgotten graves. And the deer, those silent, graceful creatures, moved through the underbrush like specters, their eyes catching the moon's pale glow, carrying the wild, untamed spirit of the forest in their blood. The mountains, it was said, enforced their own kind of justice, one far older than the laws scrawled in books or preached from pulpits in the valleys below. It was a primal justice, born from the earth itself, carved into the very bark of the ancient oaks and hickories that stood sentinel over the land. The rule was simple, etched into the heart of the wilderness: waste not, want not. If a man killed for need, to feed his family, to clothe them through the bitter winters, the forest would provide, generous in its bounty. But to kill for sport, to spill blood for the fleeting thrill of it, to leave a carcass to rot, that was to tip the delicate balance of the wild. And when that balance tipped, the killdeer came. It was no ordinary deer, not anymore. It was something warped, something risen from the decay of disrespect, a creature born of the forest's wrath. To hunters it was a nightmare-given form, a shadow that moved in the dead of night, neither fully flesh nor spirit, but something far worse. Most first heard the tale from their elders, when they were no taller than the broom that leaned against the cabin's stone hearth. On cold evenings, when the wind howled through the gaps in the pines and the fire cast flickering shadows across the room, people would settle in for the night. The elder their face, weathered as the cliffs that loomed over their valley, seemed to carry the weight of the mountains themselves. With a voice roughened by years of living in these hills, they would spin stories that made the air feel heavier, the dark beyond the windows deeper. They would say, "Listen here," their eyes glinting in the firelight as they leaned forward, with gnarled hands resting on their knees. "If you ever take a deer, you use every bit of it. The meat goes to the pot to fill our belly. The hide gets tanned for a coat or boots. With the bones, you carve into knife handles or tools. Never waste even a scrap, or it'll come for you." The killdeer. Nature don't forgive, and neither does it. Most would laugh. To them it was just a story, a spooky tale meant to scare children into behaving, to keep them from wandering too far into the woods or being careless with a gun. But as the years passed and those who stayed close, their laughter faded. They began to hear whispers from others in the mountains, loggers who spoke in hushed tones of strange shapes moving in the morning mist, their axes falling silent as they caught glimpses of something just beyond the trees. Trappers, too, shared eerie accounts of finding kills left untouched by foxes or buzzards, as if the forest itself had claimed the carcasses, marking them as its own. And then there were the disappearances, stories that hung over the small mountain communities like a fog that never lifted. Hunters would venture into the woods, men hardened by years of tracking game, only to vanish. Their camps would be found days later, cold and abandoned, their rifles twisted like soft dough, and strange tracks, hoofprints, sharp and deep, leading into the dark, only to stop abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply melted into the night. In the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, where the forest held its secrets like a miser clutching gold, two brothers, Harlan and Jed, roamed the wilds with a swagger that marked them as men who believed themselves untouchable. Born and raised in the hollows where the earth was as hard as the lives it shaped, They were as much a part of the mountains as the rocks and rivers. Yet they carried themselves like kings, lords of a kingdom they thought they could bend to their will. Harlan, the elder of the two, was a giant of a man, broad as a barn door, with a thick beard that cascaded down his chest like Spanish moss swaying in a swamp breeze. His presence filled a room, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. Jed, younger and leaner, moved with a restless energy, his wiry frame quick as a whip. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing, and his laugh, a jagged, piercing sound, cut through the quiet of the woods like the roar of a chainsaw, slicing through timber. Unlike the weathered folks who scratched out a living from the rocky soil, Harlan and Jed were not bound by want. Their father's shares in the coal mines had left them with enough money to fill their lives with comforts the mountains rarely offered. They drove trucks that growled up the winding roads, their beds loaded with gear that gleamed with the polish of wealth, rifles with scopes so precise they could spot a flea on a dog's back at 200 yards, knives sharp enough to split a hair, and ammunition enough to wage a small war. But money, for all its shine, could not buy the respect the forest demanded. The brothers hunted not to fill their bellies or warm their homes through the long winters, but for the thrill of it, the raw surge of power that came with pulling a trigger and watching life spill out onto the cold earth. It was a winter unlike any the mountains had seen in years, a season that sank its teeth deep and refused to let go. Snow had fallen for weeks, blanketing the ridges and valleys in a heavy, suffocating shroud. Drifts piled high against the pines, transforming the forest into a silent, white tomb where sound seemed to drown in the cold. Animals, wise to the ways of survival, hunkered down in their dens or burrows, waiting out the bitter season. But Harlan and Jed paid no mind to the stillness or the signs. They loaded their rifles, checked their scopes, and packed their gear with the careless confidence of men who believed the wild would bow to them. "Gonna bag us a trophy this time?" Harlan grunted, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face as he climbed into the driver's seat of their truck. It was still dark, the hour before dawn when the world held its breath, and their breath fogged the air inside the cab, curling like smoke in the chill. The forest greeted them with an eerie quiet that morning, a stillness so thick it seemed to press against their ears like wads of cotton. No birds called from the branches, no squirrels darted through the underbrush with their chattering complaints. The only sound was the sharp crunch of their heavy boots breaking through the crust of snow as they hiked deeper into the high country, following game trails worn smooth by the hooves of deer over countless generations. The brothers filled the silence with their own noise, their voices loud and boastful as they swapped stories of past hunts. Harlan bragged of the 10-point buck he'd taken the previous fall, its antlers now mounted above his fireplace. Jed, grinning, recounted the doe he'd dropped with a single perfect shot through the heart, his pride as sharp as the bullet that had ended her. "Ain't nothing better than seeing 'em drop," Jed said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow where it sank like a dark stain. "Makes you feel alive, don't it?" Hours dragged on as the sun began its slow climb over the jagged ridges, its weak light casting long shadows that stretched across the snow like skeletal fingers. The brothers pressed on, their eyes scanning the white expanse for any sign of movement. Then at last they saw him, a great buck, standing alone in a clearing, his head lowered as he pawed at the snow, searching for acorns buried beneath the frozen crust. His antlers, 12 points branching like a crown of thorns, caught the pale sunlight, and his thick winter coat shimmered with a vitality that spoke of strength and survival. He was a king of the forest, a creature that had endured the harshest winters and eluded the keenest hunters. Harlan's breath caught in his throat as he raised his rifle, the cold metal steady in his gloved hands. He peered through the scope, the buck's form filling the crosshairs, every detail sharp and clear. "Mine," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his finger curling around the trigger with a slow, deliberate pressure. The shot rang out, a thunderous crack that shattered the silence of the valley, echoing off the ridges like a warning. The buck jerked, a bright bloom of blood staining his flank, but he did not fall. His eyes, wide with shock and confusion, met the brothers for a fleeting moment before he staggered, his legs trembling. Then with a surge of desperate strength, he bolted, crashing through the trees, leaving a trail of crimson in the snow. Jed let out a whoop, his voice sharp with excitement as he slapped Harlan on the back. "Good hit! Let's track 'em," he crowed, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. The trail of blood stretched across the snow like a grim ribbon, each crimson drop vivid against the pristine white, leading Harlan and Jed deeper into the frozen heart of the Appalachian wilderness. Harlan and Jed followed it with eager steps, their boots crunching through the icy crust, their breath puffing out in clouds that hung briefly in the frigid air before dissolving. The forest remained silent around them, as if holding its breath, the trees standing like solemn witnesses to the path the brothers carved through the snow. A quarter-mile on, they found their prize. The great buck collapsed against the rough, snow-covered bulk of a fallen log. His chest heaved with labored breaths, steam rising in faint wisps from the wound in his flank, where the blood still seeped, staining the snow beneath him. His eyes, once bright with life, were dim now, clouded with pain and exhaustion, but he was still alive, clinging to the last threads of his strength. Harlan stood over the animal, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the clearing. He raised his rifle again, the barrel gleaming dully in the weak winter light, and aimed it at the buck's neck. Without a word, he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and final, echoing through the trees like a judge's gavel. The buck's body twitched once. It was a fleeting spasm before it went still, its head slumping against the log, the light in its eyes snuffed out forever. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as if the forest itself had paused to mark the moment. The brothers stood over their kill, their faces lit with a mix of pride and satisfaction. Jed crouched beside the buck, his sharp eyes taking in the sprawl of its antlers, the 12 points branching like a jagged crown. "Hell of a rack," he said, his voice thick with admiration, as he nudged the lifeless body with the toe of his boot, the gesture careless, almost dismissive. "Could mount that on the wall back home. Be a fine trophy." But no knives were drawn from their sheaths to field dress the animal. No ropes were uncoiled to bind its legs for the long haul back to camp. Instead, the brothers lingered only long enough to savor their triumph. Harlan pulled out his small camera and snapped a quick photo. He posed with one heavy boot planted on the buck's head, his rifle slung across his shoulder, a grin splitting his bearded face. Jed laughed, the sound harsh and jarring in the quiet clearing, as he slapped his brother's arm. Then with no further thought, they turned their backs on the buck, leaving it sprawled against the log, its body already beginning to stiffen in the cold. The blood that had pooled beneath it would freeze by nightfall, the carcass left to rot, a feast for crows if the birds dared to venture into that silent, watchful forest. "Too heavy to haul," Harlan said with a careless shrug as they trudged away, his deep voice breaking the stillness. He adjusted the strap of his rifle, his broad shoulders rolling as if casting off the weight of what they'd done. "Besides, we got plenty more where that came from." Jed nodded, spitting tobacco juice into the snow again, the dark stain marking their path as they disappeared into the trees, their laughter fading into the distance. Behind them, the buck lay abandoned, its once proud form now just another offering to the forest's unyielding judgment. As evening draped its heavy cloak over the Appalachian Mountains, Harlan and Jed made their way back to their temporary home, a ramshackle cabin rented from Old Man Whitaker, who lived down in the valley where the roads were more dirt than pavement. The cabin crouched at the edge of a small clearing, its weathered planks sagging under the weight of years, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to press closer as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of bruised purple and gold. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches weaving a dark canopy that swallowed the last of the daylight. Inside, the brothers kindled a fire in the stone hearth, the flames crackling and spitting as they devoured the dry wood, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. They cracked open cans of beer, the sharp hiss of aluminum cutting through the quiet, and settled into their chairs, their voices growing louder with each swig as they relived the day's triumph. "That buck never knew what hit him," Jed crowed, his sharp laugh echoing off the cabin's rough walls. He leaned back, mimicking the animal's stumbling fall, his wiry frame jerking in an exaggerated pantomime that made his eyes gleam with cruel delight. Harlan threw his head back and roared with laughter, the sound booming like thunder in the small space. The firelight danced in his eyes, turning them into twin infernos that burned with the same reckless pride that had driven them to leave the buck's body to rot in the snow. They clinked their cans together, toasting their victory, oblivious to the weight of the forest gaze beyond the cabin's thin walls. As night fell, the world outside grew still, an unnatural silence that seemed to smother the mountains. No owls hooted from the high branches, their mournful calls absent for the first time in memory. No coyotes yipped in the distance, their usual chorus silenced. Even the wind, which typically whistled through the pines like a lonesome tune, had stilled, leaving the air heavy and expectant. The brothers noticed the quiet, a faint unease prickling at the edges of their bravado, but they shrugged it off with the ease of men who believed themselves above the wild's judgment. "Storm coming," Harlan muttered, his deep voice dismissive as he tossed another log onto the fire. The flames flared briefly, sending shadows dancing across the cabin's walls. They ate a hasty meal, canned beans and bread, washing it down with more beer and whiskey, their laughter growing sloppier with each drink. Exhausted from the day's trek, they turned in early, climbing into their bunks with the creak of old springs. Their rifles, polished and ready for another day of reckless hunting, leaned against the wall within arm's reach, their barrels glinting faintly in the dying firelight. The midnight hour crept in, slow and stealthy, the kind of hour when the world felt thin, as if a fragile veil hung between the living and the dead, trembling with the weight of unseen eyes. Out in the woods where the buck's body lay, abandoned in the snow, its once proud form now stiff and cold, something stirred. It was not the return of life. No mercy lingered in that frozen clearing. The air grew thick, heavy with the sour reek of decay, a scent that clung to the throat like damp earth. Around the buck's corpse, the snow began to melt in uneven patches, revealing black soil that seemed to pulse and bubble as if stirred by some unseen force beneath the ground. The buck's eyes, glassy and lifeless in death, flickered with an eerie light, pale and cold as glowing coals. Its coat, once sleek and shimmering, now matted with frost and crusted blood, twitched as if something crawled beneath the skin, restless and unnatural. The legends whispered among the mountain folk told of this moment, passed down through generations by firelight. This was how the Killdeer was born, from waste, from disrespect, from the violation of the forest's ancient code. The spirit of the wild, roused to anger, poured itself into the empty shell of the discarded buck, filling it with a purpose that was neither flesh nor spirit, but something far more dreadful, a vessel forged for vengeance. The buck's body rose slowly, its limbs cracking like brittle branches snapping underfoot. Its head lolled for a moment, then jerked upright with a sickening snap, the antlers scraping against the low-hanging boughs of the pines, leaving deep gouges in the bark. A low groan escaped its jaws, not the proud bellow of a living deer, but a deep guttural sound, heavy with accusation, as if the forest itself had given voice to its rage. In the dim confines of the rented cabin, where the cold sometimes seeped through the cracks in the weathered walls like an uninvited guest, Harlan stirred from his restless sleep. Sweat glistened on his broad forehead, despite the chill that hung heavy in the air, curling around the room like a living thing. He sat up in his bunk, the creak of the springs loud in the stillness, his ears straining to catch a sound that didn't belong. Outside, the night was alive with a slow, deliberate crunching, like footsteps pressing into the snow, each one measured, purposeful, and far too close. His heart thudded in his chest as he leaned over to his brother's bunk, his thick fingers gripping Jed's shoulder. "Jed," he hissed, his voice low and urgent, "something's out there." Jed grumbled, his sleep-heavy eyes blinking open as he rubbed them with the back of his hand. Probably a bear, he muttered, his voice thick with groggy irritation. Or that mountain lion folks have been talking about down in the valley. But even as he spoke, there was a flicker of unease in his sharp eyes, a shadow of doubt that hadn't been there before. The brothers moved quickly, their hands reaching for the rifles propped against the wall. The metallic clicks of rounds being chambered echoed in the small cabin, sharp and jarring in the oppressive quiet, like stones dropped into a still pond. Harlan edged toward the door, his broad frame filling the narrow space as he cracked it open, just enough to peer out into the clearing beyond. The moonlight poured down, bathing the snow in a ghostly silver glow, and there, at the edge of the trees, it stood. It was the buck, the same one they'd killed that morning, its 12-point antlers unmistakable, branching like a cruel crown against the dark. Its hide was torn where Harlan's bullet had struck, the wound crusted with black, dried blood. But it was standing, impossibly tall, its presence wrong in every way. Not alive, not in the way of breathing things, but unalive, a mockery of the life they'd stolen. Its eyes burned with a pale, unnatural light, white as glowing coals, piercing the darkness like lanterns forged in some infernal fire. The ground beneath its hooves seemed to recoil, the sparse grass poking through the snow, browning and curling, as if the earth itself withered under the creature's gaze. Harlan's mouth went dry, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth as he tried to speak. "That ain't possible," he whispered, his voice barely a breath, his hands tightening around the rifle until his knuckles whitened. Jed shoved past him, his lean frame tense, his own rifle raised as he squinted into the night. "We shot it," he said, his voice hard but laced with a tremor that betrayed his bravado. "Dead as dirt." Yet the words faltered, doubt creeping in like the cold that seeped through the open door. The brothers stepped out into the clearing, their boots sinking into the snow with soft crunches that seemed too loud in the unnatural silence. It was eerily silent. The air was frigid, biting at their exposed skin, their breath forming clouds that hung motionless, as if the night itself refused to stir. The creature, the killdeer, tilted its head, its glowing eyes fixed on them, studying them with a cold, unyielding intelligence. Its jaws parted, wider than any deer should, revealing teeth sharpened to jagged points, glinting in the moonlight. That groan came again, low and guttural, rolling through the clearing like a wave of accusation, heavy with the weight of the forest's wrath. Panic clawed at Harlan's chest, his heart hammering as he raised his rifle and fired. The bullet slammed into the creature's chest, right where the first wound gaped. But there was no stagger, no spray of blood, no sign the shot had done anything at all. The killdeer took a step forward, its hooves sinking into the snow with a slow, deliberate crunch. Jed, his face pale, fired next, aiming for the head. The crack of his rifle split the night, the sound sharp and desperate, but the bullet whined off into the darkness, as if deflected by some unseen force. The creature's eyes flared brighter, their glow cutting through the shadows like a blade. "Inside!" Harlan bellowed, his voice raw with fear as he stumbled backward, yanking Jed with him. They scrambled into the cabin, slamming the door shut with a force that rattled the frame. Harlan's trembling hands fumbled with the bolt, sliding it into place with a dull thud. The brothers pressed themselves against the wall, their rifles clutched tight, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Outside, the shadow of the killdeer fell across the cabin's single window, its antlers casting jagged, twisting silhouettes that danced across the walls like the claws of some ancient beast. From above came scraping sounds, slow, deliberate. Not the rustle of branches, but the sharp rake of antlers dragging across the shingles, each scrape like a nail on a chalkboard, grating against their nerves. The men huddled by the dying fire, its embers casting a feeble glow, their eyes wide as they gripped their rifles, waiting for what came next. In the flickering, faltering light of the cabin, where the fire's glow battled the creeping shadows, Jed's voice trembled as he whispered, his words barely audible over the crackle of the dying embers. "Remember what Mama said?" His voice cracked. Thin with fear, his sharp eyes wide and darting toward the bolted door. Harlan, his broad frame hunched beside the hearth, nodded slowly, his sweat-slick face pale in the dim glow. Memories surged like a flood, carrying him back to their childhood, to the winters spent huddled around their grandmother's hearth in a cabin not unlike this one. She was a Cherokee woman, her eyes dark and gleaming like polished obsidian, her voice steady as she wove tales of the mountains. The forest spirits demand balance, she'd say, her gnarled hands working a piece of deer hide as she spoke. Kill a deer, you use every part, the hide for clothing, the meat for sustenance, the bones for tools. Waste it, and the spirit twists, becomes the killdeer. It hunts the hunters, those who kill for pleasure, who forget every deer carries the wild soul. Back then, Harlan and Jed had laughed, their young voices ringing with the confidence of boys too old for what they thought were fairy tales spun to scare children. But now, in the suffocating heat of the cabin, with the night pressing against the walls like a living thing, those words burned in their minds like a prophecy come to life. A sudden, violent crash shook the cabin, the door splintering with a sound like thunder splitting the sky. The lantern on the rickety table teetered and fell, its glass shattering, oil spilling across the dry floorboards. The liquid caught the fire's hungry sparks, and flames leapt up, licking the walls with greedy tongues, the heat blooming fast, turning the air thick and choking. Another ram came, the door buckling inward, wood groaning under the force. Then with a final, shattering blow, the creature, the killdeer, burst through, its towering form filling the doorway. Smoke curled around its jagged antlers like a crown woven from ghosts, the firelight glinting off its torn, blood-crusted hide. Where the flames touched, its fur singed, curling black and giving off a sour stench. But the creature made no sound of pain. Only that groan, deeper now, rolled from its jaws, a sound heavy with accusation, as if the forest itself had come to judge them. Jed, his face twisted with panic, swung his rifle like a club, the wooden stock connecting with the killdeer's flank. The impact was like striking stone, the shock reverberating up his arms, jarring his teeth. The creature's head snapped around, its glowing white eyes locking onto him. Its jaws, unnaturally wide, clamped down on the rifle's barrel with a sickening crunch, snapping the metal in two as if it were a twig. The broken pieces fell to the floor, discarded like a child's broken toy. Harlan, his hands shaking, raised his own rifle and fired point blank into the creature's side. The bullets punched holes in its hide, but the flesh rippled like water sealing over a dropped stone. The killdeer lunged, its hooves slamming down on Jed's back as he turned to flee. A crack of breaking bones filled the air, sharp and sickening, like dry sticks snapping underfoot. Jed's scream was raw, bubbling with blood as he crumpled to the floor, his body twitching. The creature lowered its head, its antlers, sharp and cruel, pressing into his chest, piercing slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the act. The cabin was an inferno now, the flames roaring like a beast unchained, the wooden beams groaning under the searing heat. Smoke stung Harlan's eyes as he backed into a corner, his rifle trembling in his hands. "Get away!" he screamed, his voice hoarse with terror as he fired his last shot, the bullet tearing straight through the killdeer's skull. Black, oily brain matter splattered the walls, glistening in the firelight. The creature staggered, its glowing eyes dimming, flickering like candles guttering in the wind. Then with a final, shuddering lurch, it collapsed, its massive form crashing down atop Jed, its antlers driving deeper into his chest as it fell, pinning him to the floor. Harlan didn't wait to see if it would rise again. He bolted through the shattered door, the flames nipping at his heels, their heat scorching his back as he stumbled into the snow. He ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping his face, tearing at his skin, the cold air burning his lungs with every gasping breath. His legs carried him deeper into the forest, his heart pounding like a war drum, until at last they gave out. He collapsed into a snowdrift, his body shaking, sobs tearing from his throat as he curled into himself, waiting for the dawn. When morning broke over the Appalachian Mountains, it came with a gray, heavy pallor, the sky draped in clouds that seemed to press the cold deeper into the earth. The cabin, once a rickety shelter at the edge of the clearing, was now nothing but a smoldering ruin. Ash floated through the air like dirty snow, settling on the blackened beams and charred remains that littered the ground. The forest stood silent, its trees looming like mourners around a grave, their branches still in the windless dawn. Sheriff's deputies and forest rangers arrived, their boots crunching through the frost as they picked through the wreckage, their faces grim under the brims of their hats. Amid the ashes, they found Jed's body, charred beyond recognition, his bones crushed beneath the weight of something heavy. Tangled with him was what looked like the carcass of a deer, its antlers twisted and scorched, its hide marred by bullet holes and burns. "Chronic wasting disease," one ranger muttered, shaking his head as he prodded the remains with a stick. "Makes him aggressive, crazy-like. Must have charged the cabin, started the fire somehow." The deputies nodded, their breath fogging in the cold as they scribbled notes, their explanation tidy, fitting the world they knew. But the mountains held their secrets close, and the truth was not so easily boxed away. Miles away, Harlan was found shivering in a snowdrift, his face scratched and bloody from branches, his eyes wide with a terror that lingered like a fever. He babbled to the rangers who pulled him from the snow, his voice hoarse and broken, spilling words about the Killdeer, about the dead rising, about eyes that burned white in the dark. The men exchanged glances, their faces softening with pity. "Shock," they said. "Hypothermia's got him rattled." They wrapped him in a blanket, drove him to the hospital in the valley, and later sent him home to heal. But the mountain folk, those with roots deep in the rocky soil, knew better. When Harlan's tale reached their ears, they nodded in quiet understanding, passing the story along in hushed tones over kitchen tables and firelit porches, adding it to the tapestry of warnings woven through their lives. The old ones, those who still remembered the ways of their ancestors, spoke of how to stop the Killdeer. "Fire cleanses," they said, their voices low and serious, "burns the spirit clean." Or they added, "You could destroy the brain, crush it, split it, sever the vessel that held the forest's wrath." But most didn't tempt fate. They hunted with respect, honoring the ancient code etched into the bark of every oak and hickory. They used every part of the kill, meat for the table to fill hungry bellies, hides for warmth against the bitter winters, antlers carved into art or tools. Some called it tradition, a way to honor the land that sustained them. Others called it survival, a necessity to keep the balance with the wild. In the Appalachians, it was both a truth as old as the mountains themselves. Hunters in those hills would tell you, if you asked, that not every deer in the woods was just a deer. Some watched with eyes that saw too much. Some waited, patient and unyielding, in the shadows of the pines. And if you heard hoofbeats, the slow scrape of antlers against your door, or a low groan carried on the wind like a whispered curse, you'd better pray you remembered the rules. Waste not, want not, honor the kill, or the forest would come for you. Harlan never hunted again. The man who once strode through the mountains like a king was broken, his spirit as shattered as the cabin's door. They sent him to an institution, where he sat in a sterile room, his broad shoulders hunched, his eyes darting to the windows at night. He bolted his door, even there, and listened for the silence that was louder than any sound, because the forest remembered its memory long and unforgiving. And the Killdeer, it will never forget. It was a curse, the old one said, known to the Cherokee and Shawnee who walked these hills before the settlers came. They honored their kills, gave thanks to the spirits, hunted with purpose, and used every part. Because in the Appalachians, the deer remembers, and the Killdeer waits.